A millionaire accidentally discovered a homeless girl tied to a tree in the freezing snow. His eyes widened when he saw the cardboard sign hanging around her neck. It read, The smoke curled lazily from the chimneys that crowned the narrow row of shops, vanishing into the colorless sky like small, tired sighs. In the marketplace below, the cobblestones gleamed wet beneath the slush of melted snow, and the air smelled faintly of yeast, of salt, and of yesterday's forgotten fish. Men stamped their boots against the cold, while women tucked their gloved hands deeper into their pockets. Conversations rose and fell in low, practical tones, the language of trade, of haggling, of another morning shaped by the same routines. It was easy, in such a place, to look straight ahead and not much further. Laurie had been standing there for a long time. The child was small enough to disappear into the rhythm of the crowd, small enough that few bothered to glance down where she stood, tucked between the wooden stall of a fruit vendor and the chipped corner of a lamppost. Her coat, what was left of it, clung to her shoulders like a damp rag, the sleeves frayed, the buttons long gone. Beneath it, her dress hung in tired strips, the hem stiff with dried mud. She did not feel the wind as it licked at her bare knees. Hunger had a way of swallowing sensation until all that remained was the ache, the gnawing, hollow kind that tightened her throat and dulled her thoughts. The baker, Mr. Scott, was just setting out the fresh loaves for the day. His hands, rough and red from years of labor, moved quickly, arranging the bread into neat, golden rows behind the polished glass. The warmth from his stall pushed faintly into the street, carrying with it the soft, sweet smell of yeast and butter. It was the kind of smell that made your stomach remember what it had forgotten. Laurie's fingers curled instinctively at her sides. She counted, not out loud, but under her breath. 1, 2, 3. She'd been doing that since she was small, a habit her mother had taught her for when things felt too big. She hadn't wanted to steal. Truly, she hadn't. She had stood there long enough to tell herself all the reasons not to. She could almost hear her mother's voice, soft but certain. We do not take what isn't ours, even when we are hungry. But the hunger was louder now, and the words were harder to hold on to. Her eyes darted left, then right. No one was looking. The vendors were busy arranging their goods, shouting prices, arguing over space. The crowd was thick with wool coats and moving feet. It would only take a second. The loaf sat closest to the edge, a small thing, crusty and still warm, steam gently fogging the corner of the glass. Laurie edged forward, the soles of her shoes silent against the wet stone, one hand out. Careful. Quick. Her fingers barely closed around the bread when Scott's voice split the air. Hey! Laurie flinched hard, dropping the loaf to the ground. The crowd turned, not everyone, but enough. A woman gasped, pulling her scarf tighter across her mouth. A man stepped aside, making space, eyes narrowed in disapproval. Scott came around the counter, his apron streaked with flour, his boots heavy against the stones. He reached Laurie in 3 long strides, seizing her wrist with a grip that made her wince. You little rat, he spat. Thought I wouldn't see you. Laurie tried to pull back, but her arm was trapped, pinned between his fingers like a bird's wing. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck, dried in her throat like bread crust. Stealing from me? Scott's voice rose, sharp and cutting. Stealing right in front of my face? It's just a child, someone said weakly from the side, but their voice drifted off when Scott turned his glare toward them. She's old enough to know what she's doing, he barked. Thieves don't get to hide behind tears. Laurie wasn't crying. She looked up at him, chin lifted, even as her body trembled beneath the weight of his grasp. The defiance wasn't brave. It was what was left when there was nothing else. when your body was too tired to run, when the shame pressed down on you so hard you could hardly breathe. Sometimes all that remained was to stand still. Another vendor, a broad-shouldered butcher with a thick grey moustache, stepped closer. "Maybe let her go, Scott," the man offered, not unkindly. "It's just a scrap of bread." Scott's grip tightened. If nobody ever taught her, maybe it's time someone did. There was no more argument after that. Scott dragged Laurie across the narrow street, past the stalls and the watching faces, past the barrels stacked with apples and the wicker baskets of eggs. The tree stood bare at the corner, tall and stripped of leaves, its black branches clawing up at the colourless sky. With rough hands, he tied the rope tight around her small wrists, looping it cruelly against the cold bark. Laurie flinched as the coarse fibres bit into her skin, but she made no sound. Maybe she was too hungry and tired to resist, or maybe she was mentally prepared, or more bitterly, she was used to being treated badly. Scott wasn't done. He took a piece of cardboard from under his stall, ripped the twine from a sack of flour, and scrawled a message in thick, angry letters. He hung the sign around Laurie's neck for all to see. "Beware, a thief. Don't be fooled by her looks. Stand here until night and think about your sins. I bet if your father knew how naughty you were, he would do this too." Scott gritted his teeth, then left without even glancing at her again. The wind picked up, tearing through the alley, rattling the metal signs that hung above the shop doors. Laurie's hair whipped across her face, sticking to the tears she refused to shed. One by one, the people drifted back to their business. Eyes slid away. No one spoke. The bread remained on the ground, forgotten. And Laurie stood, bound to the tree, the sign swinging gently against her chest, her body shaking as the winter settled in around her, like a silent, merciless witness. The door of Café Helena creaked open, with its familiar morning bell. Not an urgent sound, but the kind that rang like an old friend calling your name. The scent of espresso, roasted cinnamon, and something vaguely citrusy hung in the air, clinging to the windows, still fogged from the warmth within, meeting the icy January morning outside. "Morning, Mr. Anderson," the young barista said, brushing a few stray strands of hair behind her ear as she reached for the espresso handle. "You're later than usual." Johnny Anderson offered a tired smile, brushing off a few snowflakes from the shoulder of his long camel coat. "Traffic on 5th, he replied. "They're digging up the road again. 3rd time this month." She nodded, already setting a cup beneath the nozzle. "Your usual?" "Make it a double today," he said, then added with a half laugh, "The city's getting on my nerves earlier than expected." As she turned away, the man behind Johnny gave a little nudge with his elbow. "That charity dinner last night. Saw your name in the papers again," he said, voice casual but tinged with curiosity. "Children's Foundation, right?" Johnny glanced over, his expression polite but reserved. "Yeah, it's a thing we do every winter. We partner with foster programs and shelters around the city." He took the offered coffee, pressing a bill into the tip jar. "You still running that after-school thing too?" the man asked. "I don't run it," Johnny corrected gently. "I just help keep the lights on." He didn't offer more. He rarely did. In this neighborhood, people knew him as the man who paid for repairs without asking for his name to be added to plaques. He came in, said thank you, and left. That was enough. He stepped back into the cold, the paper cup warming his palms. Snow had begun to fall again, the light, dusty kind that never stayed. The streets hummed with early movement. Vendors opened shutters, shopkeepers salted their steps, and a few early risers gathered at the corner bus stop, steam curling from their breaths. As he passed the stone planter near the edge of the square, something tugged at his vision. A shape that didn't belong. It was barely there, tucked between the skeletal branches of a tree that had long since shed its leaves for winter. A bundle, perhaps, A child's coat left behind, or some kid's prank with a stuffed animal. But even from where he stood, something about the stillness was wrong. Johnny slowed his steps, coffee still warm between his fingers, though now he barely noticed the heat. He moved closer, weaving through the slow scatter of the morning crowd. Closer still, until the shape sharpened into the unmistakable curve of a shoulder, the fragile jut of a bent knee beneath torn fabric. It was not a doll. It was a child, and she had been there a long time. His coffee dropped. The cardboard sign swung gently from her neck, its corners softened by the damp air, but the black letters were still clear enough to read, "Beware, a thief. Don't be fooled by her looks." Johnny stopped cold. The words pressed heavy into his chest, their weight familiar in a way that sickened him. He looked around. People passed without pause. A few turned their heads briefly, then, just as quickly, looked away. One man shook his head, lips pursed in judgment. A woman, pulling her coat tighter, muttered as she walked past, "She stole from Scott's bakery." "That's what happens." "She's a child," he said, not loud but clear, his voice breaking the low thrum of the square. No one answered. No one stopped. He stepped closer, crouching until he was level with the girl, until he could see the pale skin beneath the messy curtain of hair, the cracked lips, the slight heave of shallow breath. Her eyes were open, barely, fixed on nothing, unfocused and distant, as though they had already drifted far from the place where her body remained. Johnny's hands moved without thought, reaching for the rope. His fingers fumbled against the knot, rough and tight, as though whoever had tied it had meant it to hold against any struggle. The coarse fibers had burned the skin raw at her wrists. Beneath the bruises, her hands were a dull, alarming blue. She didn't flinch when he touched her. Not a word, not even a blink. "Hey," Johnny said softly, voice lowering, gentling as he leaned closer. "Hey now, I'm going to get you out of here. All right?" Nothing. Not a nod. Not a breath faster. Only the smallest tremor at the edge of her chin, the faint shiver of a body too long abandoned to the cold. The rope finally gave, slipping free, and Johnny caught her before she could collapse fully against the ground. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. The lightness of her felt obscene. He cradled her gently, pushing the tangled hair back from her face, trying to find some sign of her consciousness, some flicker of presence behind those blank eyes. Still, nothing. "Somebody call for help," he called out, sharp this time, turning his head toward the people still shuffling by. A few slowed. No one stopped. The woman from earlier shrugged without looking back. "It's not like she didn't deserve it," she muttered again. Johnny's jaw clenched so tightly, it ached. He lifted Laurie carefully, holding her close against his chest, as though by sheer proximity he could warm her. She didn't resist. Her head fell softly against his shoulder, her body limp. Johnny didn't bother to shout again. The streets blurred as he moved, fast now, weaving between the passers-by who watched him with either disinterest or mild curiosity, but never outrage. His car waited at the curb, engine still warm from the drive. He laid her across the back seat as if she were made of glass, tucking his coat around her as best he could, fingers fumbling at the buttons. Her small hands hung loose at her sides. "Stay with me, sweetheart," he whispered, leaning close enough that his words stirred the wisps of hair near her ear. "Just stay with me." She gave no answer, but when he touched the fragile pulse beneath her jaw, there was still the faintest beat, slow and fragile as the wing of a trapped bird. The coffee cup Johnny dropped on the ground looked like it could freeze at any moment, yet a skinny body was there, just to cling to life. The thought made him shiver, but not because of the weather. The fluorescent hum of the emergency room had a way of making even the softest voices sound sharp, too bright against the hush of worry that floated in the air. Somewhere nearby, the metallic scrape of a gurney echoed down the hallway, wheels rattling unevenly against the tiles. A nurse gave quiet instructions, clipped but calm, and beyond the frosted windows, the city kept moving, oblivious, indifferent. Johnny stood by the nurse's station, his coat half-buttoned, scarf still looped loosely around his neck as if he hadn't yet decided whether he was staying or going. His hands, tucked deep into his pockets, gave him away, fingers clenched, shoulders tight. The attending physician approached with the measured expression of someone well-practiced in bad news. "Is she your daughter?" the doctor asked, glancing briefly at the clipboard in his hands. Johnny shook his head once, firmly. "No." "Relative?" "Number." The doctor paused, waiting for the rest of the explanation, but Johnny only stared back at him, jaw set. "I found her," Johnny said quietly. "Outside. She was tied to a tree." The doctor blinked. "Excuse me?" "In the square. Outside a bakery. She was freezing to death." The doctor sighed, rubbed a hand down his face. "City's getting colder, in all the wrong ways." He gave Johnny a look, not suspicious, not accusing, just tired. "Severe hypothermia," the doctor said after a moment. Her body temperature was dangerously low, malnourished, signs of untreated pneumonia. The cold made it worse, much worse. She's lucky to still be breathing. Johnny exhaled slowly, the air slipping out of him like it had been held too long. "Is she awake?" he asked. The doctor shook his head. "Not yet. We're warming her up gradually, but she's weak. Very weak. We'll monitor her through the night." "And the bruises?" Johnny's voice caught despite himself. The doctor met his eyes carefully. "There's rope burn on both wrists and some bruising on the arms. Older marks on the back and shoulders too." He didn't add more. He didn't need to. Johnny swallowed hard, nodding once before stepping away toward the narrow hallway that led to the intensive care wing. The room where they had placed her was small, sterile, quiet, except for the slow beeping of the monitors that counted each beat, each breath. Machines hummed softly, feeding warmth and oxygen where Laurie's body could not do the work alone. A nurse adjusted the IV line at her side, then left without a word, the door clicking shut behind her. Laurie lay still, her face pale beneath the thin oxygen mask, dark hair tangled across the white pillow, like thread unraveling. The sign they'd hung around her neck was gone now, but Johnny could still feel the weight of those words, could still see them swinging in the wind. He sat down slowly in the chair by her bedside, his hands folded awkwardly in his lap. For a long while, he said nothing, just watched the soft rise and fall of her chest beneath the hospital blanket. "She's not mine," he whispered finally, though there was no one there to hear it, but her. But no one else was going to stop. He leaned back, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes for a moment before letting out a breath. The tension in his shoulders remained. Outside the window, the city lights began to blur against the gathering dusk. The hours stretched. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting lines, scribbling notes onto charts. Johnny stayed, silent and unmoving, except to stand now and then, stretching stiff limbs, pacing a slow, careful path between the chair and the door. At some point, near midnight, he pulled his phone from the inside pocket of his coat. The screen lit his face dimly, the reflection of his tired eyes staring back. A few calls from Assistant Sarah, a few work emails and business invitations, ceremonies, parties. "It can be handled tomorrow. Today there is only one job at this hospital." He closed the photo quickly, locking the screen, shoving the phone back into his coat pocket like it burned. The hallway clock ticked on. Nurses whispered at the desk, their voices low, glancing once toward the man who still hadn't left. They recognized the look in his eyes. They'd seen it before, the look of someone who waits, though they don't know why. The next morning broke slowly, grey light bleeding through the half-drawn blinds. Johnny was still there, slouched in the chair, elbows on his knees, hands folded beneath his chin. He hadn't slept. When the nurse entered to check the monitors, she paused, blinking in surprise. "She's awake," the nurse whispered, and Johnny's head snapped up so quickly his neck ached. He stood, cautious, approaching the bedside. Laurie's eyes were open, barely, staring straight up at the ceiling. Blank. Unmoving. "Hey," Johnny tried, his voice rough from the long silence. "You're at the hospital. You're safe." No response. But then, after a moment, so faint he wasn't sure at first that he'd heard her, the girl turned her head slowly toward him. Her lips parted, voice little more than breath, cracking and raw. "Are you going to tie me back to the tree? To pay the hospital bill?" The words hit him like a punch. Johnny's knees bent without thinking, bringing himself level to her gaze, his hand gripping the edge of the mattress like an anchor. "No," he said softly. "No, sweetheart. No one will ever do that to you again." Her eyes didn't soften. Not yet. But she blinked once. Slowly. Her breath hitched, the slightest tremble at the corners of her lips. Johnny stayed kneeling there, still as stone, not reaching for her, not pressing more words into the space between them. Just waiting. The machines kept their slow, steady rhythm beside them, counting out each fragile moment. And in that quiet, something between them began, small, tentative, uncertain. But there. Laurie closed her eyes again, not from pain, but from something closer to rest. The city had already begun to fold into night when Johnny left the office. The sky outside his window had shifted into the blue-gray of early evening, the kind of color that made the glass look like fogged steel. Paperwork still waited on his desk, half-signed contracts, reports flagged with yellow tabs. But his mind wasn't in the numbers tonight. It hadn't been for days. By the time he reached the hospital, the lobby had quieted. The stream of daytime visitors had thinned into the soft shuffle of night staff, their shoes whispering along polished floors. The overhead lights hummed steady, indifferent. Somewhere near the elevators, a vending machine gave a soft, mechanical sigh as it spat out a package of crackers into the bin below. Johnny's shoes echoed lightly as he walked down the hallway toward the pediatric wing. He loosened the knot of his tie, but didn't bother to take it off. His coat, still buttoned against the evening chill, held the faintest smell of the espresso he'd left unfinished on his desk. When he reached Laurie's room, the door stood ajar. It took him a moment to notice the flicker of movement at the far end of the space, the quiet rustle of fabric, the creak of the cabinet hinges opening as carefully as they could. Laurie's small frame hovered in front of the hospital's mini-fridge, one thin hand reaching inside, fingers trembling as they curled around the edge of a plastic-wrapped roll. There was a slow, deliberate caution in the way she moved, as though each breath might betray her, as though the walls themselves might shout her guilt. Johnny stepped in quietly, but didn't speak right away. He watched the way she paused before sliding the roll into the pocket of her hospital gown, as if she half expected it to vanish before she could claim it. She turned then, startled, eyes wide. Not the wild defiance of anger, but the brittle flash of fear. Her fingers clenched the edge of the cabinet door so tightly he could see the knuckles pale. "I wasn't going to take much," she muttered, before he could say anything, voice low, flat. "Just enough. I was leaving anyway." Johnny raised his hands slowly, palms open, staying where he was. "Laurie," he said gently, "you don't have to sneak out. You don't have to take anything." She shook her head hard, chin dipping toward her chest, eyes dropping to the floor between them. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. Just stood there, thin and steady, like a match about to snap. "I'll be fine," she whispered. "I've been fine." There was something in the way she said it, too even, too rehearsed, like she'd had to explain herself more times than anyone her age should have to. Johnny let the silence hold between them for a beat before he spoke again. "Where would you go?" he asked softly. Laurie shrugged without lifting her eyes. "Back to the street," Johnny continued. "Out into the cold." Her fingers clenched tighter. She pressed her lips together, jaw stiff. "I'm not asking you to stay here," he said, stepping just a little closer, but still keeping space between them. "But if you'll let me, I can take you somewhere warmer than this. Just for a little while." Still, she didn't speak, but her eyes flicked upward, wary. "My house," Johnny said. "Not forever. Not unless you want it. Just until we figure something out. Until we find a place that feels right for you." Laurie's head shook again, a fast, instinctive no. "I'm not going to touch you," Johnny added quietly, his voice steady, measured. "Not unless you tell me it's all right. You can yell if I ever do anything you don't want. You can run. I won't stop you." Her gaze lifted fully now, searching his face, waiting for the catch. The trick, hidden behind kindness. Johnny held it, steady and still, letting her look. "I'll stay on the other side of the room," he said. "I'll keep my distance. I don't want to leave you out there alone." For a moment, Laurie said nothing. The refrigerator hummed faintly behind her. Somewhere down the hallway, the muffled beep of a monitor counted out the rhythm of another life. Finally, Laurie's lips parted. "If you try anything," she said, voice small but solid, "I'll scream." Johnny nodded once. "Good." He waited. Laurie hesitated only a moment more, then gave a single, stiff nod. The ride was quiet. Johnny drove with the radio off, the heater low, the windshield wipers ticking steadily against the falling snow. Laurie sat curled small against the passenger door, arms folded tight across her chest, watching the blur of city lights as they passed. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The house stood near the edge of the city, tucked back from the street behind a short row of hedges and a black iron gate that clicked softly as it opened. The porch light was on, casting its soft yellow glow across the front steps. Inside, the warmth hit them gently, the faint smell of pine wood and the last of a cinnamon candle burned low on the counter. Johnny stepped aside, letting Laurie enter first. She hovered near the doorway, eyes scanning the space, the high windows, the clean lines of the furniture, the coat rack standing politely near the entrance. He didn't tell her to take off her shoes, didn't ask her to sit. "I'll show you where the guest room is," he offered, voice low, careful. Laurie didn't move. Instead, she slid down the wall beside the door, knees drawn tight to her chest, back pressed against the frame, like she might still need to run at any moment. Johnny paused, watching her settle there, small and defensive, folded into herself like a cornered bird. "I'll leave some water on the table," he said, "and a sandwich, if you're hungry." No answer. He set the sandwich down near the edge of the coffee table, poured a glass of water, and placed it gently beside the plate. He made no motion toward her, didn't close the space between them. Laurie stayed where she was, eyes cast low, breathing steady but shallow. Johnny sank slowly into the chair across the room, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped together. "I'm not going to ask about the bread," he said quietly. "Or about your family. Not unless you want to tell me." Her gaze didn't lift, but the set of her shoulders shifted, just slightly. "I'm just glad you're not out there tonight," he added. The clock on the mantel ticked softly into the quiet that followed. And in that room, beneath the soft hum of the heater and the creak of the old wooden floor, the distance between two strangers held, but only just. The first snow of February came soft, drifting down in slow spirals outside the tall window beside Johnny's desk. The flakes caught the edge of the lamplight as they fell, bright for just a second before they melted into the dark street below. Inside, the house held its quiet. It was the kind of quiet that didn't come from peace, but from absence. The stillness of words unsaid, of two people sharing the same space, but circling it carefully, never quite stepping into the middle. Johnny sat at the desk in the small office just off the living room, the glow of the laptop screen washing pale light across his tired face. A half-finished report blinked on the screen, the cursor waiting, patient as ever. Numbers lined the spreadsheet, neat and certain, the way numbers always were. But Johnny's mind wasn't there. The hours had pressed long into the night before he even noticed how late it had become. His body gave in before his mind did. Head resting against the back of the chair, arms folded loosely across his chest, the soft breath of sleep pulling him under. He didn't see the way Laurie stood at the threshold, one hand gripping the edge of the doorframe, her eyes narrowed in the half-light. She hovered there longer than she meant to, watching. The lines of his face looked different in sleep, softer somehow, the sharpness worn down beneath exhaustion. Slowly, awkwardly, she padded toward the living room, careful not to let the wooden floor creak beneath her bare feet. She tugged the blanket off the corner of the couch, clutching it in both hands as though it might fight back, and crept toward the desk. For a moment, she just stood there, the blanket heavy in her arms, staring at the man asleep beneath the faint glow of the lamp. Then, as gently as she could, Laurie draped the blanket over Johnny's shoulders, the ends falling awkwardly over the arms of the chair. She stepped back quickly, as if afraid even that small kindness might betray her. Without a word, she slipped away, retreating back to her place by the front door, curling into the familiar corner with her knees drawn tight to her chest. The next morning, Johnny woke with a start, the light outside already softening into day. His neck ached from the awkward angle, but it wasn't the stiffness that held his attention. It was the blanket. He stared at it for a long minute before reaching up, fingers brushing across the fabric, tracing the fold where it had been placed. He smiled, but only faintly, the expression quiet, private. He didn't say anything when he saw Laurie later that morning. She sat cross-legged on the floor by the door, as always, arms wrapped around herself like armor. She looked past him when he offered her a small wave, eyes fixed on the far wall. But that night, after the dishes were done and the last light in the hallway was dimmed, Johnny left something on the table by the couch, a small box of colored pencils, neatly tied with a rubber band, and a thin stack of blank drawing paper. He didn't mention it. Laurie ignored the box for 2 days. But on the third night, long after Johnny had retired to the back of the house, she picked up one of the pencils, turning it slowly between her fingers. She tested the point on the edge of the paper, then, cautiously, began to sketch. A tree, lopsided, but recognizable. A figure beneath it, small, faceless, wrapped in a scarf. It was the thunder that broke the rhythm between them. The storm rolled in hard, the sky cracking open with sudden violence. The windows rattled in their frames, and the flash of lightning threw long shadows against the walls of the living room. Laurie woke with a jolt, gasping before she could catch the sound in her throat. She pressed her hands against her ears, curled smaller into the corner, shoulders shaking as the storm cracked again overhead. The front hallway light snapped on. Johnny stood at the edge of the room, his hands loose at his sides, his gaze steady, but gentle. He didn't move toward her, didn't ask if she was all right. Instead, he leaned back against the frame of the door, cleared his throat softly, and began to hum. The melody was old, one his mother used to hum when the nights were too long and the dark felt too big. Simple, soft, almost tuneless, the kind of song that doesn't need words to do its work. Laurie's head stayed down, her knees still tight against her chest, but her fingers slowly uncurled, pressing flat against the floor. The storm outside grumbled on. Johnny kept humming. 2 nights later, over a plate of scrambled eggs and toast that Johnny had left quietly on the coffee table, Laurie finally broke the quiet between them. "What's your name?" Her voice was thin, cautious, but clear. Johnny looked up from the book he had been pretending to read. His smile was soft, almost surprised. "Johnny," he answered. "Johnny Anderson." Laurie nodded once, chewing at the corner of her lip. There was a long pause before she added, almost as an afterthought, "I'm Laurie." "I know," Johnny said, setting the book down. "I asked the nurse, but I wanted to wait until you wanted to tell me yourself." Laurie's eyes flicked away, but her shoulders settled just a little, the lines of her body less tight. "Nice to meet you, Laurie," Johnny said softly. "Yeah," she murmured, picking at the edge of her toast. "You too." In the days that followed, the small gestures continued. Johnny made sandwiches and left them on the table without asking if she wanted them. Laurie began to eat a little slower, stopped glancing over her shoulder, as often, while she chewed. The pencils moved from the box to the table, then to her hands. The sketches changed. The tree remained, but now there were birds in the branches. A scarf, this time with stripes. The words between them stayed sparse, but the space between those words began to fill with something lighter. Not trust. Not yet. But the quiet beginning of something like it. The morning held the quiet grey of late winter, the sky thick with the promise of more snow, though none had yet begun to fall. The streets were slick with the remnants of yesterday's melt, small rivers of slush tracing crooked lines along the gutters. Johnny's breath rose faintly in front of him as he walked, his gloved hands wrapped around the familiar weight of a takeaway coffee cup. Cafe Helena had been warmer than usual that morning, the scent of baked goods and orange peel still clinging to his coat. 2 weeks had passed. 2 weeks of soft words and careful distance, of slow mornings and small meals, of Laurie eating just enough to stay upright, drawing quietly in the corner where she still seemed to feel safest. 2 weeks, and Johnny had learned not to ask much. Not yet. The routine had steadied itself into something that felt almost natural. Or, at least, predictable. Coffee in the morning, then work, then home again by evening. A rhythm he could hold on to. This morning, though, he lingered near the bakery. His steps slowed out of habit more than intention, the warmth of the cup slipping steady into his fingers as he crossed the square. The sound of voices drifted from the open door of Scott's shop, rising above the usual bustle of vendors setting out their wares. "Whole day, I left her there." Scott's voice cut sharp through the cold air, loud enough that even the butcher next to him winced a little. "Tied good and tight, right where folks could see. You should have seen how fast she tried to squirm when I caught her." A laugh. Not a loud one. Not the kind that rings with joy. No. This one was bitter, lazy, the sort of sound that comes from a mouth too used to cruelty. Johnny paused near the stall, the rim of the coffee cup hovering just below his lips. He didn't drink. "Had to shut early, though," Scott went on. "Some idiot must have come by and cut her loose. Should have known. Soft hearts. They always ruin the lesson," he snorted. "But I bet the brat's still out there somewhere. Doubt she's dead yet." The butcher chuckled uneasily, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, eyes darting toward the square. "Yeah," Scott grinned, wiping his hands on the front of his flour-dusted apron. "Would have done her some good to sit there another night, though. Maybe next time she'll think twice. The words sat heavy in the air, thicker than the smoke curling up from the carts nearby. Johnny didn't move at first. Then slowly, he stepped forward, setting his coffee cup down on the edge of the stall with a soft, deliberate tap. The sound of it was small, nothing dramatic, but the shift in the air was immediate. Scott turned, halfway through another boast, and froze when he saw Johnny standing there, coat still buttoned neat against the wind, eyes steady but hard. "I see the bread's still on your shelf," Johnny said, his voice low, even. "Funny thing about that?" Scott blinked. "The bread you lost is right there," Johnny continued, gesturing faintly toward the neat row of loaves behind the glass. "So I guess the only thing missing here is your heart." Silence followed. The butcher took a half step back, folding his arms across his chest, looking anywhere but at Johnny. Around them, the square seemed to pause. Not stop, not fully, but slow, the way a room does when someone's dropped a glass and it hasn't yet shattered. Scott's mouth opened, then closed again. "I don't care how you run your business," Johnny went on, quieter now, but with a weight that pressed into the space between them. "But if I ever hear about you tying up a child like that again, I won't be the only one standing here asking questions." His words were soft, but they did not waver. Scott's lips pressed thin. His hands curled tight against the edge of the counter, the white dust of flour smearing across his knuckles. Johnny leaned forward just enough that their eyes met level. "She's 10, Johnny said. "A child. And all she wanted was a piece of bread." A faint murmur stirred behind them. A woman at the next stall. A young vendor across the way pretending to arrange apples. Eyes moved quickly elsewhere whenever Johnny's gaze lifted. The butcher cleared his throat, but said nothing. Scott's face colored, jaw tight. But he didn't speak either. Johnny stepped back, picked up his coffee, and let the silence hang there a moment longer before turning away. "Have a good day," he said without looking back. The square resumed its hum as he walked away, the soft crunch of his boots against the salted path, the only sound that followed him. Later, back at the house, Johnny placed the fresh loaf of bread carefully on the kitchen counter. He stood there for a moment, staring at it, the steam still rising faintly from its golden crust. Behind him, Laurie sat where she often did, knees pulled up to her chest, sketchbook balanced against the tops of her legs. She didn't look up. Johnny reached for a plate, sliced the bread slowly, methodically. "Would you like a piece, Laurie?" he asked, voice as even as if he were asking about the weather. Her pencil stilled on the page. For a second, her body didn't move at all. Then, without lifting her head, she gave the smallest nod. Johnny cut 2 slices, placed one on a plate, and slid it toward her, careful not to move too close. The bread was warm, software safe. The days grew longer, but the winter air clung stubbornly to the city, wrapping the streets in its dull grey arms, unwilling to let the season go. The snow had hardened into patches of ice along the sidewalks, slick beneath hurried feet, though the skies above had begun to soften, showing blue here and there between the clouds. At Johnny's house, the heater hummed steadily, offering its quiet comfort to the rooms where the words were still few and cautious. Laurie had claimed her familiar spot near the door, sketchbook always within reach, her pencils now dulled at the ends from use. It was not the place where a child usually belonged. Not on the floor, not pressed small into the corner like a piece of furniture meant to stay unnoticed. But Johnny had long stopped asking her to sit anywhere else. She would move when she was ready, and slowly, almost without meaning to, she had begun to. It started with the sketches. First, they appeared on scraps of paper left on the kitchen counter, then tucked beneath the edges of the coffee table. Flowers at first, uneven petals, stems too long, leaves drawn like they were still figuring out how to belong on the page. Then trees, bare-branched and reaching, their roots tangled beneath the lines of the paper. Then, one morning, a single drawing left at the edge of Johnny's desk. A small figure holding an umbrella over a child, crouched beneath the bend of a tree. No faces, no names. Just two silhouettes, drawn in soft pencil strokes, standing close beneath the shelter of something bigger than both of them. Johnny had paused when he saw it, his hand resting lightly on the page, tracing the umbrella's curve with the tip of his finger. He didn't say anything when Laurie wandered past later that afternoon, though he caught the quick glance she gave him from the corner of her eye. Instead, he pinned the sketch to the side of the refrigerator, right beneath the grocery list. It stayed there, untouched. It was one of those evenings when the air outside rattled softly at the windows, the kind of breeze that whispered more than howled. Inside, the small living room glowed with the low light of the table lamp, casting gentle shadows against the bookshelves and the far wall where Laurie sat, her knees drawn up, sketchbook balanced across them as always. Johnny was at the other end of the couch, flipping through a magazine he hadn't really been reading. The room held its quiet well, not uncomfortable anymore, but still cautious, like a house learning the weight of its own walls. Laurie's pencil scratched softly against the paper. She paused, once, glancing up from her drawing, eyes settling on Johnny without quite meeting his. "My mum," she began, voice barely above a whisper. Johnny set the magazine down, his hands folding gently into his lap, waiting. "She used to tell me to count to 10, Laurie continued, eyes lowering back to her sketchbook, the pencil trembling just a little between her fingers. "When I was scared. When things were loud. She said if I counted slow enough, the bad stuff would go quiet before I got to 10. Johnny nodded once, steady, his eyes soft. But the last time, Laurie's voice cracked there, and she pressed the back of her hand quickly to her mouth. She blinked hard, swallowing the burn at the corners of her eyes. The last time, she didn't wake up. The words dropped into the space between them, too heavy to lift. Johnny didn't reach for her, didn't fill the air with sorries or platitudes. Instead, he stood slowly, stepping into the kitchen where the small bowl of apples sat on the counter. He picked one, slicing it clean with the careful rhythm of someone who has learned that slow hands are often kinder than quick words. When he returned, he held out a slice, resting it on the edge of the table nearest to her. Laurie didn't take it right away. She kept her head low, hair falling forward like a curtain between them. But then, after a long moment, she reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the plate, pulling the slice gently into her lap. Johnny sat back down, not beside her, but near enough that the space between them felt like an invitation rather than a wall. No questions, no demands, only the small offering of being present. The next morning, Laurie's sketches had changed. There were still flowers, still trees. But now, in the curve of the branches, small paper shapes hung from the limbs. Tiny folded cranes, stars, hearts, drawn delicately along the lines of the page. Paper flowers, bright against the pencil grey of the trunks and sky. Johnny found one pinned quietly to the fridge, tucked beneath the corner of the grocery list once again. At the bottom, in the tiniest handwriting, there was a single word scrawled beneath the drawing. "Thank you." He stood there for a long while, just looking at it, before he reached for the magnet and pressed it firmly back into place. That night, before the lamp was turned off and the quiet wrapped itself back around the house, Johnny paused at the doorway where Laurie sat cross-legged with her sketchbook balanced on her knees. "I'm not your dad," he said softly, voice low but certain. Laurie looked up, blinking, unsure where the words were going. "But if you ever need someone to stand there with the umbrella," he added, "I'm here." Laurie's lips pressed tight, holding back whatever trembled at the edge of her breath. She didn't answer, But when Johnny turned to leave, he heard the soft scratch of her pencil starting again. And in the middle of that page, beneath the wide arms of another crooked tree, two small figures stood, their hands almost touching. The sun hung low in the sky, stretching pale light across the kitchen floor, soft enough to blur the sharp edges of the day. The heater hummed faintly in the background, the only steady sound in the house apart from the soft scratch of Laurie's pencil against paper. Johnny stood at the counter, staring down at the coffee cooling untouched between his hands. The words he needed to say had been circling his mind for days now, pressing hard against the inside of his chest. But still, they sat there, unsaid. It was Sarah who had found the place. She had come by the house 2 days earlier, her laptop tucked under one arm, papers stacked neatly in her hands. The name of the shelter circled twice in bright blue ink. Good reputation, she had said, her tone gentle but sure. Smaller classes, trained counselors. They take care of the kids, like family. It's the right kind of place, Johnny. And maybe it was. On paper, at least. Safe, clean, structured. A home that could give Laurie the kind of things he wasn't sure he could. Friends her age, school, the chance to grow up without so much weight pressing down on her small shoulders. But knowing the right thing and saying it aloud were two very different battles. Even though he knew he had feelings for Laurie, it wasn't like the feeling he had when interacting with other disadvantaged children at the orphanage. He felt the resilience, strength, and weakness. But he didn't want to be selfish. Every child deserved to live in harmony with their friends. He took a breath, steadying himself, and crossed the room. Laurie was on the floor by the window, the morning light soft across the pages of her sketchbook. Her knees were drawn tight to her chest, the familiar position she had held onto like armor. "Laurie," Johnny began, his voice softer than he meant. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" She didn't look up right away, just kept the pencil moving, tracing the shape of what looked like the outline of a bird's wing. Johnny crouched, keeping his distance, hands resting lightly on his knees. Sarah and I, he corrected himself quickly, we found a place. A good one. They have other kids there your age. They have school and art supplies and space to run around. People who know how to help. Laurie's pencil stilled, but she didn't raise her head. Johnny let the pause stretch between them before continuing. "It's not that I want you gone," he added. "It's just, I want you to have choices, Laurie. I want you to be somewhere where you can be a kid again, somewhere that's yours." Finally, she looked up. Her face stayed still, unreadable. "Okay," she said, voice flat. No protest, no questions. Just that one word, dropped like a stone into the quiet. Johnny's throat tightened. "We don't have to rush," he said quickly. "They can wait a few days if you want." But Laurie only shook her head, small and firm. "It's fine." And then without another word, she stood, closed the sketchbook, and walked down the hall. The next morning came too quickly. Johnny stood at the front window, watching the frost slip down the outside of the glass, his arms folded tight across his chest. Donna arrived just after 10, her car idling outside the gate, the soft plume of exhaust curling into the air like smoke signals. She was kind, older, warm-eyed, the kind of woman who smiled softly as if trying to make herself smaller so the children she worked with wouldn't feel so small. Johnny helped Laurie pack. There wasn't much. A few clothes Sarah had bought, folded neatly into a worn duffel. The sketchbook, slipped quietly into the side pocket. The box of colored pencils tucked beneath a spare sweater. When it was time to go, Laurie stood by the door, her hand clenched tight around the handle of the bag, her face unreadable. Johnny knelt down in front of her, his voice gentle. "You can always call me," he said. "Anytime. I'll be there, okay?" Laurie nodded once, but didn't look at him. Donna smiled gently from the doorway, waiting without pushing. They walked to the car together, Laurie climbing into the back seat without a word. Johnny stood a few steps away, watching as the engine rumbled softly beneath the weight of the moment. Donna gave him a quiet nod, then turned to settle into the driver's seat. The door clicked shut. It should have ended there. But as Donna shifted the car into gear, as the tires crunched softly against the gravel, Laurie's small hands slammed hard against the glass. She hit the window once, twice, 3 times, her breath fogging the glass as the first crack appeared beneath the weight of her fist. "No!" she cried out, voice cracking. "Stop! Stop! I want to go back." Donna reached quickly to unlock the door as Laurie twisted the handle from the inside, shoving it open before the car had even rolled to a full stop. She stumbled out, bare hands slapping against the frozen air, running hard back toward the house, back toward where Johnny still stood, frozen by the gate. "Don't make me go!" Laurie shouted, tears hot against the red of her cheeks. "Please, don't make me go." Johnny didn't think. His arms were already open by the time she reached him. She crashed into his chest, the sobs shaking her small body, her fingers clutching tight into the fabric of his coat, like if she let go she might disappear entirely. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say yes. Please, I want to stay. I want to stay. Don't send me away. I want to read books with you every day, even if it's an economics book." Johnny chuckled. He dropped to his knees, his arms wrapping fully around her, holding her steady, his own voice thick as he whispered into her hair. "Okay," he murmured. "Okay, sweetheart. You're not going anywhere. You're home." Behind them, Donna stood quietly by the car, watching, her expression softening as she turned her eyes away to give them space. Johnny held Laurie closer, rocking gently as the winter wind moved past them, the snow beginning to fall again, soft and slow. 9. The days after Laurie chose to stay settled into a quieter rhythm, as if the house itself had taken a slow, careful breath. There were fewer walls between them now, still there, still cautious, but softer around the edges. Johnny found her most mornings at the kitchen table, head bent low over her sketches, the colored pencils spreading across the surface like small soldiers at attention. She still didn't say much, but the way her eyes lifted now and then to meet his gaze across the room told him more than any words could. There was laughter sometimes, small things, a half smile when Johnny burned the toast, a quiet chuckle when she caught him dozing off with the news still playing on the television. They began reading together in the evenings, economics, as promised, though Johnny slipped in a few children's classics between the chapters of market theory. It was nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just the slow, patient work of building something that neither of them had thought they would have. And then the call came. It was Sarah, her voice careful, each word measured, as though it had been rehearsed before she dialed. "Johnny," she began, "I need to talk to you. In person." The conversation waited until evening, after Laurie had gone to her room, the door shut gently behind her. Sarah arrived with her laptop, tucked under one arm again, but this time, no blue ink circled the papers she brought. She sat across from Johnny at the kitchen table, her fingers laced tightly together, knuckles pale beneath the grip. "I know you've been thinking about adoption," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I know how much she means to you." Johnny nodded, though he didn't speak. "I started doing the background checks, like we always do," Sarah continued. I thought it would be straightforward, but it's not." She opened the folder slowly, sliding one page across the table toward him. "Her mother's name was Lauren." "Yes?" Sarah asked, though they both already knew the answer. Johnny's eyes lowered to the page, scanning the words. Police records, hospital reports, toxicology screens, dates, names. Too many words where there should have been the simple history of a struggling single mother. She wasn't sick, Johnny, Sarah said quietly, at least not in the way Laurie thinks. Johnny's jaw tightened. Lauren was arrested twice for possession. There's record of trafficking charges that were pending before she died. Overdose, not illness. She was using, and she was selling. The words landed between them like a stone thrown into still water, breaking the calm they'd both tried so hard to keep. Johnny leaned back in the chair, his hands pressed against the table, fingers curled tight against the edge. "Does Laurie know?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. Sarah shook her head. "Number. And I don't think anyone ever told her. She believes her mum got sick, that she just didn't wake up." Silence settled heavy in the room. Johnny stared down at the folder, but didn't reach for it again. "There's more," Sarah said softly, reluctantly. "If this comes out, if the investors find out you're planning to adopt the child of a known dealer—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Johnny's name had been printed beneath too many charity galas, carved into too many donation plaques. His face had smiled out of too many polished photographs with clean headlines like "Champion for Children," "Patron of Hope." People like their benefactors simple, untangled, clean. "I had to tell you," Sarah finished. "You deserve to know the risks." Johnny nodded once, but his gaze stayed fixed on the window beyond her shoulder, the sky outside already dark, the faint shape of falling snow beginning again. That night, the house was quiet long after Laurie had gone to sleep. Johnny sat alone in the small chair by the window, the folder still unopened on the table beside him. His hand hovered near it once or twice, but never landed. Outside, the streetlights threw thin halos into the snow, the flakes catching the light as they fell slow and easy onto the silent street below. He watched them, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, elbows resting on his knees. There was no anger in him, only the ache of knowing what this would mean. Not for him, but for her. He imagined Laurie's small hands drawing those flowers, folding the paper edges clean, sketching roots into trees as though planting them might keep her steady. He thought of her eyes the day she had run back into his arms, the way she had clung so hard it felt like she might never let go. And he knew. No headline would ever weigh as much as that. The night wore on, the coffee on the table growing cold beside him. His body leaned heavier into the chair as the snow kept falling, covering the city in its quiet white hush. When the first soft light of morning pressed faint against the window, Johnny was still there, watching, waiting, deciding. The morning unfolded quietly, the kind of quiet that feels heavier after a night spent awake. Snow lay soft against the windowsills, undisturbed, as if even the world outside had chosen to move a little slower. Johnny stood by the kitchen window, his fingers wrapped loosely around the handle of his coffee mug, though the coffee inside had long gone cold. His eyes followed the slow drift of a single snowflake sliding down the glass, tracing its uncertain path. He hadn't touched the folder again, not because he needed more proof. Sarah had given him enough. Not because he doubted the truth, but because staring at the words on those pages wouldn't change what he already knew in his bones. The knock on his office door came just after 8. "Come in," Johnny called, voice quieter than he intended. Sarah stepped inside, carrying the weight of the conversation still etched into the lines of her face. She paused by the doorway, waiting for his permission to sit. Johnny nodded toward the chair across from his desk. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft hiss of the radiator, working steadily against the cold. Then Johnny leaned forward, elbows on the desk, fingers loosely folded beneath his chin. "I'm not adopting Laurie because her past is clean," he said, calm but certain. "I'm adopting her because she deserves a future." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. She nodded once, slowly. "You know the board will ask questions," she said. though her voice lacked the warning tone from the night before. It was softer now, more of a fact than a threat. "I know," Johnny replied. "Let them ask." Sarah looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up at him. "I'll handle the paperwork," she said quietly. Johnny gave a faint smile, the kind that barely touched the corners of his mouth but softened the lines around his eyes. "Thank you," he replied. Later that week, Johnny arranged a meeting with Donna from the shelter. The sun had already begun its slow dip toward the horizon when he arrived at the center. The building was plain, unassuming, with a modest sign tucked neatly against the front gate. Inside, the walls were painted with soft colors, lined with crayon drawings and photographs of smiling children. Donna greeted him with her usual warmth, her eyes kind beneath the weight of her years in the work. "I appreciate you coming. The kids loved the cereal you brought them the other day," she said, as they sat down in her small, cluttered office, the smell of coffee and old paper filling the space between them. "Thank you, Donna. Today, I need to talk to you about Laurie. You are an experienced and knowledgeable person with children, so I thought I should tell you." Johnny began, voice steady. There's some history about her mother I wasn't aware of until recently." Donna nodded slowly, waiting. "She wasn't the person Laurie thought she was," Johnny continued. "Lauren was involved with drugs, trafficking. She didn't die of illness. It was an overdose." Donna exhaled softly, leaning back in her chair. "I see," she said. "Thank you for telling me." Johnny's hands rested flat against the edge of the desk. "I know what this means, Donna. I know how these things look on paper. But I also know Laurie, and I know she's not her mother." Donna gave a faint smile, folding her hands gently in her lap. "Johnny," she said, her tone soft but firm, "I've worked with children for over 20 years. You learn pretty quickly who's in it for the headlines and who's in it for the heart." She paused, studying him for a moment. "That little girl doesn't see you as a savior. She doesn't even see you as the man who rescued her. She sees you as home." Johnny's throat tightened at the word, but he nodded. "So, if you're asking whether this past disqualifies you from giving her a future," Donna continued, "my answer is no." Johnny leaned back slightly, the breath he'd been holding finally easing from his chest. "I'm ready to start the process," he said, formally, "whatever it takes." Donna reached across the desk, pulling a thick folder from the stack beside her. "Then let's get started." That evening, back at the house, Laurie sat on the living room floor, her back propped against the couch, sketchbook open across her knees. She was drawing again, a tree this time, full of branches, each one carefully traced, the leaves unfolding soft across the page. Johnny stood in the doorway, watching her quietly for a moment before stepping closer. "Laurie," he said gently. She looked up, pencil pausing mid-line. "I wanted to tell you something." She didn't speak, but her eyes held his, waiting. "I spoke with Donna today," Johnny continued. "I told her I want to adopt you, not foster." "Adopt." The pencil slipped from Laurie's fingers, landing soft against the page. "I know this isn't what we planned," Johnny added, "but if you'll let me, I'd like to make this your home, officially." Laurie's eyes widened, blinking fast, her mouth parting but no words finding their way out. "You don't have to decide right away," Johnny offered softly, kneeling down so they were eye level. "But I wanted you to know I'm here, for as long as you'll have me." There was a beat of stillness, the air between them holding its breath. Then Laurie's fingers reached out slowly, closing around Johnny's hand, where it rested against the edge of the table. "Okay," she whispered. "Yeah, okay." Johnny smiled, his free hand lifting gently to rest over hers. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, steady and soft against the glass. wrapping the world in its quiet white hush. Spring arrived shyly, creeping in beneath the stubborn hold of winter, bringing with it the first soft blush of green along the edges of the streets. The ice melted away from the sidewalks, leaving behind tiny rivers that caught the afternoon light, glittering like silver threads across the pavement. Laurie stood by the door that morning, her coat zipped to her chin, her small hand tucked tightly into Johnny's larger one. The school gate stood just a block away, bright with the chatter of children, the swing of backpacks, the gentle buzz of early laughter. She held his hand a little tighter as they walked. Johnny didn't rush her. Step by step, they moved down the street together, his free hand tucked into his coat pocket, the morning air cool but kind. When they reached the gate, Laurie paused. Her eyes scanned the playground, faces she didn't know yet, voices that hadn't called her name. Johnny knelt beside her, one hand still wrapped around hers. "You're going to do just fine," he said softly. "I'll be right here when you're done." Laurie nodded, slow and small, then let go of his hand and walked through the gate. Johnny stayed where he was, leaning back against the fence, a book in hand, though he barely read the words on the page. His eyes lifted now and then, following her small figure as she hovered near the edge of the playground, watching, waiting. Every day he stood there, quiet, steady, a familiar shadow at the edge of her new world. Evenings belonged to the two of them. They shared the couch, Laurie curled into one corner, comics spread open across her knees, Johnny at the other end, finance reports resting on his lap. Sometimes they read aloud to each other, her voice soft but growing braver, stumbling over long words that Johnny helped her sound out, patient as ever. Between pages, Laurie would steal quick glances at him, eyes flicking toward his face, waiting to be caught. When Johnny noticed, he'd smile and tap the corner of her book. "Keep reading, kiddo." And she would, but with the faintest grin tucked at the corner of her lips. The walls of the house had begun to change too. Sketches appeared here and there, pinned beneath magnets on the fridge, taped gently to the hallway near her bedroom. Flowers, trees, stars. Paper cranes folding into the edges of the pages, their wings wide and free. But one drawing, more than the others, held its place on the living room wall. It was the last one she pinned herself. Two small figures stood beneath the heavy arms of a big tree, the same shape, the same rough branches Laurie had drawn so many times before. But this time, there was no rope around the trunk, no sign swinging with cruel words. Instead, the cardboard sign that hung softly from one of the branches carried just a single word, written carefully in Laurie's small, neat handwriting. Safe. Johnny had stood staring at it for a long time the night she taped it up, his hand brushing faintly across the paper, tracing the lines of the tree. He didn't move it. He didn't frame it. He just let it stay exactly where she'd placed it. Some nights when the house settled into its quiet and the lamps flicked off one by one, Johnny would sit for a while at the edge of his desk, looking out the window toward the street beyond. The soft hush of the neighborhood drifted through the glass, the rustle of leaves outside tapping gentle against the pane. In the quiet of those moments, his thoughts always circled back to the same truth. It wasn't perfection that made a home. It wasn't the neatness of a past or the cleanness of a name. It was the choice, the stubborn, brave, everyday choice to stay, to show up, to be the one who remains when everyone else has gone. He thought of Laurie's small hand in his that morning, of the shy smile she had given him as she walked through the gate. And he knew, a child doesn't need perfect parents, only someone brave enough to stay. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Sometimes life gives us the chance to witness not grand gestures, but the quiet courage it takes to simply stay, to stand beside someone when they are at their smallest, their weakest, to hold space for their pain, their healing, and their hope, without asking for anything in return. In a world that too often turns its back on the broken, may we remember, every child deserves to feel safe, to be seen, not for where they came from, but for where they are going. And sometimes, all it takes is one person brave enough to believe that they are worth the wait. If you are listening to this story in the morning, have a nice day, and remember to bring a hat when going out if it is sunny. If it is evening, have a good night and sweet dreams. See you in the next story.